Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI. I'm Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies from broadband to blockchain. Today, artificial intelligence promises to transform our world. But AI won't reach its potential without accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. When most big companies need to address a strategic development, more often than not, they call one of the big professional services and consulting firms, and that certainly has been the case with generative AI. That's why I'm happy to be joined for this episode by Lara Abrash, the Chair of Deloitte US, the largest professional services organization in the United States with over 170,000 employees. Lara and I discussed where we are in the process of realizing the business potential of generative AI and where what Deloitte calls trustworthy AI fits into that process. We also talked about the role of boards, whether AI will assist or replace employees, the importance of stakeholder engagement, and how Deloitte itself tries to stay ahead of the curve in both understanding and benefiting from AI. Lara, really great to have you as a guest on the Road to Accountable AI.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
There's been a tremendous amount of excitement about generative AI in particular, at least since late 2022. But recently, there have been reports that companies are not necessarily seeing the payoffs they expected, and questions about whether maybe the hype wave is passing. What are you seeing, and what's your perspective at Deloitte?
Yeah, generally, that's an accurate statement. The hype is starting to settle down. If anything, we're starting to see maybe even more impatience with seeing companies want to unlock value. And, some of it is there's experimentation going on all over. You'll hear examples of use cases that are delivering, I'll say, some benefits, most likely in the area of productivity, but these really large, big unlocks of value, we're not seeing that happen. And there's a variety of reasons that are driving that, but that is definitely where we are in this curve. But it can and will change quickly.
What's going to make it change, you think?
Well, some of the issue is really just learning, and so getting each individual company, each individual department trying to focus on their own use case. At this point, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. So I think part of this is starting to focus on who is going to be best positioned to identify scalable, large ways of developing use cases. That's one area. So we're starting to see a lot of tech providers, consulting firms like ourselves are starting to look to industry pervasive solutions. So that's a big area, is really trying to figure out a place that we can concentrate it. The other thing is really realizing that most companies were not in the best position to really drive scalable generative AI, whether it's lacking a data strategy that they really need to be able to do this, having the right flexible technologies, having an environment where there's I'll just say a desire to adopt and to move quick, and a lot of focus on productivity and, quite frankly, some wasted money. And that just becomes a virtuous cycle of people getting a little bit timid and afraid of this. So it's going to require investment. It's going to require taking some risks. And then ultimately, it's more expensive than people probably thought it would be at the onset. This is very different from all technologies we've seen in the past, where there is no day one and it's all over. The cost of keeping and maintaining these models goes on for a really long time. And people are starting to realize that, building versus buying an LLM and then maintaining an LLM on their own is just much more costly. So there's a lot of things coming together that are preventing sort of the day one really big unlock, but that won't last forever. I mean, this is still an amazing technology that's going to do a lot of great things, but we're not where I think CEOs and boards thought they'd be at this point in the game.
Where does trustworthy or responsible AI fit into that process of scaling up?
Yeah, so it's a really important part of it. It is something that I'll just say companies are all talking about. They understand there's a need to be trustworthy. There are different phases of, I'll say, maturity relative to what that would mean. And building that in on the front end is yet another thing that is preventing them from maybe moving super fast, because not all the companies really have a framework, have the ability to have their compliance organization set up. I mentioned the data, the privacy, all those things need to be really built and thought through on the front end. And then there's a certain amount of testing of these systems to make sure they're actually creating safe and secure outcomes. So that's another important barrier that companies are all learning about. What you're also seeing is the tech companies and consulting firms are starting to build that into their solutions early on, as opposed to, again, making every company try to do it themselves.
It's obviously not something you can generalize across all the different engagements you have, but what are the major things that companies are coming to a consulting firm like yours for in this trustworthy AI area?
Well, one is around, is this something that we do separate and distinct from developing the generative AI strategy, or is it something that we should be embedding? And our philosophy is generally embed this on the front end. So when they're coming to us, it's really around strategy of what does a Gen AI strategy feel like and implemented like into our overall strategy. And then how do we then get this trustworthy AI done properly? Like, what are the steps we need to be taking as we start to build solutions? And whether it's the capabilities of the people that are around the development and deployment of the technology, how the data strategies are being built, the compliance and the regulatory environment that this particular client is in. But the key is they're looking to us to be part of it from the overall strategy, not a trustworthy AI strategy. That in itself will never get it integrated, embedded into the technology.
How convinced are they that there's a need for that trustworthy piece, that it's not just something that's for show or really peripheral to the business?
They all say the right thing. I think depending on the company, you're getting legitimately different answers. There are companies that are global and already, because of regulatory environments around the world, that are different than if you're a U.S. Company. There already are requirements that they have to put in place. Then you've got sort of this regulatory overhang. Even today, there was an article about the state of California coming out with some potential legislation, which is, again, maybe contrary to what people were thinking this would go. So regulation is a big thing that I think is an overhang. The boards are asking for it, and we could talk later about where the boards are generally. But if you're a tech company and you're building in a generative AI solution and you're not talking about trustworthy AI, your board, your management team, this is your brand. I mean, this is that you can have a vulnerability come to fruition after. So it's real, but there are other places that are talking about it, but it's not necessarily coming with real action. And, I worry that we're going to have a major footfall because if you don't get this right everywhere, you run the risk of getting it wrong everywhere, because it's not something, what people are going to learn about generative AI is such a powerful technology, and it's relating a lot of ecosystems coming together. One place having a significant footfall will have a major impact on the technology and how it's being, I'll say, affecting other people throughout the environment.
What would you say is the biggest area of concern? There's a whole range of issues, from bias to explainability to intellectual property, privacy, and so forth. Is there an area that has come to the forefront in terms of these trustworthy AI concerns?
Well, definitely bias is one, because it can mean a lot of different things. A lot of people jump to bias as meaning in itself, it's just taking certain classes of people and impacting them differently. But the reality, biases could mean so many different things to how the data is formed, how it's used. So I'll just say that's an area that comes up in almost every conversation we talk about. And it's whether the data itself and how the technology is being run is actually representing the same information of the people that are affected as to what you would expect if a human would do it. Now, the reality is that there's bias in human behaviors as well. And so we could talk about that as well. People, I think, have a higher expectation for this technology than even the human being. But bias is definitely the one that I would say I hear more frequently. Of course, safety and security are other ones as well. Is it creating harmful outcomes? A lot of that can come back to bias.
And what does an organization that sees that problem need to do first? What's the most important thing to address those concerns about bias?
And now this is going to sound really fundamental, but the first thing is actually having a framework of what their guidelines and guiding principles are around what it means to have trustworthy AI and what their objectives are for achieving an outcome that's free of bias. And however they measure that, again, it could be the same amount of bias if a human being was doing it. But starting at the very forefront, there needs to be an intent as to what does an organization want to do relative to how it builds the technology. And then it could be a variety of who's actually sitting around the table. A lot of companies have AI councils that they formed, and the job of the council is really to start to think about how is our data being parsed and used, and is the data actually reflecting the information that we want. And then there's all sorts of testing on the systems itself. But it does really start at the very highest level with a set of guiding principles. And that set of guiding principles should be for all the elements of what's trustworthy. And it needs to have attention to, I'll just say, the commercial drive for moving AI a lot faster. And there's going to be a trade-off all the time relative to the pace you can move to create something that's trustworthy, but maybe getting the impact that you want to get.
Yeah, I found it interesting that there was a report that Deloitte put out on generative AI in the enterprise that talked about trust in two different senses. Trust in terms of trusting the accuracy and reliability of the outputs of the AI system, but also the employees being trusting that this is not just going to replace them or make their lives worse. Isn't there a tension there, though, that the things that might be most efficient for the business might not be the things that lead in the direction that is most either in the interest of employees or in the interest of the most accurate systems?
Yeah, well, the first thing is just if you want to have the organization adopt these changes, there actually has to be a willingness to do it. At the end of the day, you could drag a lot of time out if the employee base ultimately does not really commit to the change. So you don't really have a choice. You do need the employee base to trust you. It's ultimately about being really honest about what you know and don't know. A lot of clients I talk to have said to me that this is ultimately about reskilling and upskilling. And if you believe them, it's ultimately about taking the work that someone does today and take elements of it and say, you know, this is going to be done by the technology, which is not a novel concept. This is already happening in automation and bots and things like that. But that the individuals themselves are going to be at a higher end of the value chain, and they're going to be doing things that they wouldn't otherwise been able to do. But the proof is in the pudding. If at the end of the day, someone says that to the entire organization and then goes and lays off everybody, well, then they haven't been truthful. But it is going to be, the reason we talk about it, it is going to drive the pace of change if the employees are not adopting it. Because the people who know the use cases are the people that are doing the processes today. You need them to be bought into helping with the solutions. It's a circular issue. So I think companies just need to be really honest about what they know and don't know. And the reality is we may not have all the answers about what the benefits will be and what some employee's life will be after, but it will make their job a lot easier and better. And ultimately, we'll see if we can skill or upskill them. And that's why it's so important. Otherwise, you will not have an adoption of change.
How should a company, though, think about where to draw the lines? What are the activities that it makes sense to try and outsource to the AI versus the things that you want to ensure that there's still human involvement?
Yeah, I'll say I have a strong bias here that, you know, this is about making the human better. This is not about replacing the human at the end of the day. I know there's all sorts of videos going back, you know, decades about what AI could do, and the AI will build the AI, and then we won't have a need for humans. I think the reality, as long as we all live on this earth, you know, human beings on one hand need meaning and purpose, and jobs create meaning and purpose for a human being. And two, they bring things that ultimately the technology will attempt to do, but I don't believe it'll ultimately ever get to the level of a human being, the creativity, the emotional quotient. So when the technology is being built, it should ultimately be thought of as how is the technology enhancing what a human can do, as opposed to how is the human enhancing the technology. And so it's really about driving it to make them better at what they do. We use the word co-pilot, the technology as the co-pilot, but I'm ultimately flying the plane. I've got the years of experience, the expertise. It creates challenges down the road relative to grooming a workforce to be able to lead a plane and have a co-pilot, because sometimes you need to be the co-pilot to be the pilot. We could talk about that too. But ultimately, it's got to be something that makes the human perform at a higher level, and ultimately take away things that the human is not really adding value. It's just not an area that the human being can add value.
You mentioned earlier the position of boards. I'm curious what you're hearing from boards that you talk to right now about trustworthy AI in particular.
Yeah, this is an area where I would say boards are, again, in different levels of maturity, depending on the board that they sit on. Most boards are in the, if I put maybe sort of, again, these tech companies or the people that are more sophisticated in the space, they're in the place of trying to understand what does it mean to actually have a board that understands generative AI. Is the CEO and the management team doing the things that they should be doing? They're more focused on the benefits and implications of generative AI and getting themselves rallied around that. The way I see trustworthy AI comes up, they don't necessarily use these words, but a major part of their responsibility is around the reputation, the brand of the organization that they're governing. And so the focus they'll have is, are there things that we need to be doing? Are there things that could potentially be happening that could inhibit our brand? Now, if they're regulated, back to that place, that's a core responsibility of the board. But without that, right now, when I hear it come up in a more overt way, it's really around the brand responsibility, the risk appetite of the company. Is this driving more risk? The word trustworthy AI is not used as much in boardrooms, but it in essence is getting to the same topics.
How are boards, though, going to get the expertise that they need to deal with these kinds of issues, especially if it's not a tech company or a very technically sophisticated board?
So it's really interesting. A few years ago, people, when they were talking about generative AI broadly, not just in the boardroom, they would talk about the need to actually develop deep technologists, people who had really, really deep understanding of generative AI, technology, and data. And now, if you fast forward to today, the reality is there's much less of a focus on that. And it's really around the best athlete approach. And what we want are people that have a domain expertise, that know enough about the technology to know the implications. And I would say you see the same thing in the boardroom. The more sophisticated companies are they may have technologists sit in their boardroom, but it's not necessarily to create a 12 or 8-person technology board. It's to have some people in the room that may be super deep. For the others, they're focused on fluency and creating enough of an understanding, but without losing the domain expertise. What makes them effective in the boardroom is their skills around governance, their skills around running businesses, and then ultimately the industry and the company they're governing, knowing it so deeply that they can now question and probe those things. The other thing I'm seeing, and I'm a big supporter of, is sort of on-demand learning, making sure that when in the life cycle it makes sense to create a learning environment into the boardroom, they're doing that, whether it's bringing in experts, law firms, consulting firms, technology companies, to bring an outside objective voice, someone other than the management team sort of articulating this is what's going on in the outside world, or finding other sort of educational things they need to do. So I see a mosaic in the boardroom. It's not 8 or 12 technologists. It's people that really understand the role of governance, business, and the companies they're working with, but that they're sufficiently steep in this technology that they can ask the right questions.
With generative AI, though, it's interesting in that, on the one hand, this is very deep, very sophisticated, very complicated frontier technology. On the other hand, there's this magical experience that you have, that you get an interface and you talk to it in natural language and so forth, which can to some extent create the illusion that it's simpler than it is, or that it really is a person on the other end. So is having broad understanding of what's going on beneath the hood more important in this environment, or less so than with the previous waves of AI and tech development?
It's definitely more important. It doesn't mean it's just a Gen AI board, but you do need to understand the example I gave you earlier, that this is not a 6 or 9 or 12 month sort of technology implementation and then it's off to the races, or some standardized off the shelf package that you're using. This is ultimately something that's a breathing technology that could do it. It could go off. It could have hallucinations. You ultimately need to understand the risks of that from the board perspective. And I would say the thing that probably makes this, in my opinion, much more board worthy is there's immense opportunities, but there's also immense risks to business models than other technologies maybe have likely done, where parts of a business may be disintermediated, or ultimately a new entrant can come in because they can access things like generative AI and create a different type of workforce. So the role of the board ultimately needs to be the long-term value of an organization. And so they need this deeper understanding to really, again, objectively challenge what's actually happening with our competitive set and be able to sense real time. Are there things that are going to suggest that, what we do, we made widgets yesterday. Are we still able to make widgets in a post-Gen AI world? And really ask those questions. So to your point, they do need to be deeper than just implementing a SaaS technology for payroll. I mean, a lot of this is at the core of the business.
You alluded earlier to the possibility that there would be a big foot fault or some big foot faults around AI. Do companies need to think any differently than they already are about risk management to anticipate and mitigate those challenges? Or is it something that if companies have a good risk program, then they're in the right position?
Well, I don't know of any company that would say that their risk program doesn't need to be improved. I've seen a lot. There are some that are, I'll call black belt, and they're really good. But for all of them, this changes the risk profile of a company. It changes the type of workforce that the company is potentially going to have. It's going to require different sorts of compliance and regulatory exposures, potentially different lawsuits coming from people coming in and saying that some technology, particularly in the early years, harmed them in a certain way. So all those things are things that are going to suggest there's new emerging known and unknown risks that probably haven't been vetted in the past. And again, you need people with complete expertise in risk to then know enough about what this technology is doing, and also being sensing. That's a big part of I'll say a change in how the board needs to be thinking about its role. I think in the past, this idea of being so close to changes in the market weren't as relevant. If you're going to be managing and mitigating risk, you can't be risk adverse in this environment. We don't have a choice. You won't be competitive anymore. But at the same time, you need to be thinking about, how do I prepare for a risk when it does happen? And are there insurance companies? Are there captives? Like, what am I going to do if at the end of the day I get sued by my workforce because how they get impacted by this? Unions, all those things are things they need to be thinking about, which is a broad topic we could talk about today if you like, Kevin. I think one of the things I'm not seeing happen as much is really shaping external stakeholders. There's this pressure right now to have generative AI deliver these immediate results, and investors are looking for it. You have people that are in and out of these companies' stocks really quickly, and if they don't see it, they beat them senseless. But do the investors themselves understand what it means to have trustworthy AI, and and how is a company making those choices? That's just an example of, there are a lot of constituents that need to be educated by a company around what it's doing relative to how it's embedding Gen AI and the choices it's making.
How do companies do that effectively?
Well, a couple things. I mean, one is just starting by, I'll say, old-fashioned, coming up with a stakeholder matrix, like who are the key constituents that they're going to need to deal with. And then ultimately deciding, is this something that they do as an individual, or are they better served doing it as a cohort? So if it's an industry, as an example, take life sciences. Life sciences is a regulated business. Do they come together and talk about how they think they're applying the regulatory requirements already to what they're doing? Should they be subject to even more requirements? How do they take investors who invest speculatively across this industry? Do they use trade groups to talk through this? Do they, hire like law firms to go out and like engage in lobbying effects to basically start to bring them along the way? But until you do that, you've got a group of people, and I'm using investors as an example. You could use credit agencies, other shareholders, the employee group, the list will go on and on. They need to be thinking about, what they want to say to them. But it all starts with actually, and I don't think we've talked about this, you actually need an integrated strategy that says how Gen AI is going to be used in the organization, not a Gen AI strategy. That's probably the one, I'll say, major thing I hear people talk about is they need a Gen AI strategy. The reality is you have a strategy. How is Gen AI going to augment what you do in the execution of your strategy?
So that sounds like it means that it'll vary a lot by organization.
It should. I mean, depending on what the opportunities are. In some organizations, this could merely be about back office productivity gains and doing things differently, leveraging Gen AI. In other organizations, it could be take life sciences. How a pharmaceutical drug is now developed is completely different. The whole R&D experience is completely different because of how generative AI is being used. So once it starts impacting both I'll say the core business as well as the back office, it has a much more pervasive effect across an organization.
What's your sense about the way the regulatory environment is developing around the world?
Well, outside the U.S., we clearly have a less litigious environment, so there's a lot of reliance on regulation, and that already exists. We've seen it in almost every topic you could speak of. Here in the U.S., it is interesting seeing now some states start to focus on it. Many would say, as I mentioned earlier, that many industries are already regulated, and a lot of the elements of generative that are concerns around generative AI fall under that. And then you're seeing all of these executive actions. It seems to me that there's a bit of swirl, and I think ultimately the test of this will be does this make the U.S. not competitive anymore? And I think if that concern gets to a certain point that we're now going to lose pace with some parts of the globe, that's when you're going to likely see pressure. But it's like nothing else. It's going to have a lot of political debates going on. Like the pandemic, the states are going to want to have their say. And you're already seeing this with California, and you've seen this with other rules. So there's no clear answer for us, but I think the thing that everybody's going to be focused on will be the element of being competitive. And if that all of a sudden puts us at a significant disadvantage, I think that'll put a lot of pressure on how far can we hold our companies at hostage.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about how you and your organization address the challenges of generative AI. How do you ensure that your people have those skills they need and are in position for that use of AI to accentuate people, as you talked about?
Yeah, so one of the first things we did, and it took a while to actually get ourselves comfortable that we could do it at scale, is we really started to create, I'll just say, areas for our people to play, and allowing them the ability to essentially, go in and ideate and incubate, with our own technologies, things that we're comfortable with them using that meet our standards, not necessarily some third party, and allowing them the ability to start to get comfortable with it and start to create their own ideas about what they can do with it, and create I'll call it a clearinghouse of ways to make sure we're not doing things externally that we're not comfortable with, but just the ability to have a place to play and starting to stimulate that's actually something we want our people to do. It was a big part of getting them to be more comfortable. We're still the same place everyone else is. We've had some episodic outcomes where I would say a really good use case that makes a lot of sense and that people are excited by, but we haven't seen something that all of a sudden does everything we do so differently across the line. But for our people, it's just talking about it as a comfort level. We do benefit the tenure of our organizations on the younger side, and this is one of the things I think over time is going to change this I'll just say trepidation. I mean, think about if you're a junior high or high school right now, you're leveraging generative AI and technology freely, and you're going to enter our workforce expecting this. And so we have a younger workforce, so we don't have as much, I'll just say, resistance from that element of the workforce. I think broadly, all companies will start to benefit from this push. It's going to be a natural push as people join organizations. Almost like, why aren't you using this? I used it every day in my college life. You should be using it here. So we're going to have a benefit of like a bit of a passage of time that we're going to have natives coming into all companies.
But presumably there are some things that people use consulting firms and other professional services firms for that will no longer need to be outsourced, or they won't need to be willing to pay the same amount with what the tools provide with generative AI. So how do you think about the potential impacts on your business?
Yeah, well, we definitely see some things that when we do something more efficiently, will someone say, well, is it the same pricing that you had before? So we are looking at that. We're also looking at net new opportunities. I mean, the area that I would say, forget even just Deloitte as a firm, the professional services firms, the consultancy firms across the board, the big and the small, have really spent a lot of time in the last decade to 15 years helping companies grapple with technology and how to implement and run technologies. This is going to have the same, I'll say, halo effect for the companies that need that assistance. They'll look to places like Deloitte, they'll look to some hyperscalers, because at some point that expertise is better served outside your organization. But what the person outside doesn't know that you know better than anybody is your own organization. So it's this marriage of both. But I would say we've seen this across the board in almost every wave of technology, the last wave being around the cloud, which has had a pretty long run. All of that came to companies coming to firms like Deloitte and others to get that expertise, get that assistance, and even run some of these technologies for them as opposed to pay their own people to do that. So it's going to go in both directions, I think, for us. But at the end of the day, our role is really about going where the market goes, and the market is likely helping clients think about how this technology gets deployed.
So last thing, looking to the next few years, what's the biggest development that someone should look to in an organization that's going to impact development of generative AI, and in particular with regard to these concerns about trustworthy AI?
I think inside an organization, the work that companies are doing right now around, I'll say, really focusing on the enablement across the board and building in at the front end what it means to be trustworthy AI, that's going to be the biggest unlock. So some companies, this is the first time you're hearing the words trustworthy AI. Other organizations are hearing it and starting to think about, well, what does this mean to build it in up front? And without regulation or without a footfall of any sort, it's going to be this pressure of, can I do something and meet the market? And in the next 2 or 3 years, I think it's going to be ultimately their ability to really pull together that framework that I mentioned and the ability to start locking in real examples of what being trustworthy looks like. So when they have a use case that they are actually ready to pilot and go live into their live system, have they done everything that their framework would suggest that they feel really good about relative to this, transparency, the safety, the biases, all those types of things. I think those building upon each other, people will start to realize what it means to be trustworthy. The worries I have are the footfalls, the regulatory environment pushing, and even the employees really resisting it. All those things are going to cause people to drag their feet.
But it's interesting. You focused really on internal expertise in the organization as opposed to some new development in technology.
Well, you mentioned inside, outside. I think ultimately what we're starting to see a trend of is companies, just like almost any other business challenge, saying, do I need to do this all myself? And so they're starting to look to third-party hyperscalers or consulting firms and saying, is this something you could do for me? So if you look at the big hyperscalers now, the idea of having trustworthy AI is part of their brand. And if they can get some big unlocks in use cases in focusing on either industry specific things or I'll say pervasive generic areas of an organization, and the organization says, wait, I can go to somebody who has a built out use case, it's more cost effective, and they're taking responsibility for the trustworthiness of the data and all the outcomes. That to me is the likely big unlock when it comes to trustworthy AI. Other than it's your bread and butter, for the average company, it's going to be hard to invest all it needs to do to get that outcome, which is why I think the consulting firms and the technology firms, the lawyers, all these folks are going to be really well positioned to help companies think about how they make that next big push.
Lara, thanks so much for having the conversation with me.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciated you having me. So thank you.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening. This is Kevin Werbach. If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program, featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.